What you doing here? Don't you have practice?
Not anymore, I quit.
Oh. Well, since when are you the quitting kind?
I don't know, I just don't see the point anymore.
Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
I can do this.
You can do it!
This time you're going down!
There's no way he can win. I believe in you!
That's it! He's not gonna make it!
He's gonna make it. I know he will!
Gotcha! Impossible!
He's doing it! He's really doing it!
Yes! That's it! He's got him now!
Is this really happening?
He did it! It's finally over!
That's how winning is done! That's how winning is done!
Normally, I start these videos with a summary, but I honestly don't know where to start. Worldless is an abstract game that revels in its abstraction. But if I had to give it the old college try while refraining from spoilers, I'd say you play as a cosmic entity at war with another entity, and the resulting struggle is necessary for existence? I don't know, I tried. All you need to know is you're a white and blue feminine being who really wants to absorb her black and orange masculine counterpart. And thus, the chase commences. Insert joke about marriage here, pause for laughter and or groaning, and move on. Once one side absorbs the other, then they turn green. Like I said, it's tough to understand and even tougher to describe. Its symbolic nature and lack of explanation on its more administrative aspects makes the opening hour pretty confusing. What's up with all these constellations? What are these nodes? What is this thing I just collected? What the f*** even is that? There's a lot players are going to be initially confused about. This could attract some players while turning others off, but I swear, if you trust that the game knows what it's doing and put in the effort to pick up what it's putting down, you'll find that Worldless might be your next favorite Metroidvania. It is an absolute travesty. I didn't play Worldless prior to dropping my top 10 Metroidvanias released in 2023 video. Link in the description, card up top, subscribe for more Metroidvania content. Had I played Worldless in 2023, it'd not only have made the list, but it would have ranked high on that list. But I'm not here to lament or speculate about past transgressions. I'm here to talk about Worldless to determine, in the cosmic expanse of Metroidvanias at our disposal, if it's an MV you should prioritize. And what better way to start than by discussing its easy to pick up, easy to get overwhelmed by combat system.
Combat.
The first thing to note concerning Worldless's combat system is that fights are initiated when you find an enemy, and combat's turn-based, which is highly unusual. The only other MV I can think of that does this is Monster Sanctuary. But the difference between Worldless's combat and Monster Sanctuary's combat is that Worldless's combat is much more active. I know a lot of people might immediately compare it to Super Mario RPG or Sea of Stars, but I'm an absolutely shameless f***ing weeb, so I'd say combat's actually closer to games like Valkyrie Profile, Super Robot Tyson OG Saga, and Project Cross Zone, and even the more recent Indivisible. Like those games, you don't directly control your character in battle. You input button and directional commands, and your character pulls off whatever move you input. For instance, you press the melee button and your character will run up and strike with her sword. Press the button 3 times and she'll pull off a 3-hit combo. You can then link moves together by timing your inputs. I like to do a 3-hit melee combo followed directly by an up melee button input to do a strike that launched the enemy, to which I followed up with an airborne 3-hit combo. There are a ton of different inputs and attacks, so trust me when I say you're more likely to get overwhelmed than bored. Seriously, every button on this controller is used for something. I forgot more attacks than I actually used. I tell you all this because I thought combat was gonna get stale. Can you blame me? It's a turn-based system. How many times have you played a JRPG and just turned your brain off and engaged autopilot? Not in Worldless. I'm happy to report combat was never not exciting. That's largely contributed to two factors. One, the game continually adds attacks to your arsenal, with every attack actually adding something new to combat. And two, you can parry everything. Remember, Worldless's combat is turn-based, which means your enemy gets a turn to strike back once you're done attacking. The best way to describe this back and forth is to label the two parts of combat the player phase and the enemy phase. The length of the player phase is shown by this meter under your character. It depletes over time rather than by action, and once it's gone, it's the enemy's turn to bust you up. There's no discernible way to know the length of the enemy phase, but they're typically pretty short with only a few attacks. Each attack they do is telegraphed with some sort of flashy visual effect. Horizontal lines are physical attacks, vertical lines are magical attacks, and the so-called star signs are attacks that can only be blocked with a perfect physical parry, which means you gotta hit the button at just the right moment to avoid any damage. All incoming attacks can be parried. You just gotta have great timing and use the correct defense button. That's right, there are dedicated buttons for physical and magical attacks, so you gotta stay on your toes. Of course, you can get more defensive actions as you progress, but I'm not spoiling that for you. Maybe in the spoiler section. And that's the basics of combat. Attack during the player phase, then defend during the enemy phase. Don't worry if you're not great at parrying. Most attacks can be blocked just by holding the correct defense button, but each attack blocked this way removes a layer of defense, which are these clear barriers. If all these layers break, you're vulnerable for the rest of the phase. Layers replenish over time, but it's always best to try and parry if you can, as successful parries keep your layers intact. I'm awful at parrying, but I was able to pick it up eventually. And you'll need to pick it up because some of the later fights are brutal. With the basics out of the way, let's talk about the more advanced stuff. This stuff has to do with the player phase. There are two advanced mechanics you're going to want to understand sooner rather than later: combo variation and guard break. Combo variation is kind of self-explanatory. The more varied attacks you do, the more damage you do. So don't spam stuff and your damage output won't decrease. You have two types of attacks, physical and magical, and each type has different moves you can pull off either by pressing a button, holding multiple buttons, and or inputting a direction. Like I've said multiple times already, there's a ton of attacks at your disposal, but which ones should you use? That's what this section's for. These icons tell you which type of attack will break the enemy's guard, and breaking the enemy's guard is what you want to do. Remember this meter that dictates how long the player phase lasts? The more of these icons you break, the more time you recover, allowing you more time to attack. Break all these icons and your attack damage doubles for the rest of the phase. And this leads us to our final mechanic, absorption. Depleting the enemy's HP is one way of defeating it, but it's not the desired way to win. The desired way is to absorb your enemy. Absorbing your enemy gives you the opportunity to end a fight early as well as gain a skill point for your skill tree. More on that in the progression section. To absorb an enemy, you have to hit them enough to fill this meter to the white line while also not taking damage. You get hit, the absorption meter decreases. Once you reach this line, press both bumpers to begin the absorption minigame. The worst part about Worldless is combat. It works well in the early game, but eventually becomes a pain. Basically, to absorb the enemy, you have to hit the correct button prompts before time runs out. If you don't hit the right buttons fast enough, the enemy regains HP and the fight continues with the absorption meter empty. As you can see, some of the inputs are unknown, so you have to guess. It's frustrating to leave things to chance in such a highly technical game. You can reveal these unknown inputs by going beyond the white line, but then you have a very real chance of killing the enemy, forcing you to start the encounter from the top, which is also really frustrating. This minigame doesn't break the game, and it can lead to some really intense moments, but it's just not my favorite. Alright, time for a quick combat recap. You find enemies while exploring, and combat initiates. There are two phases: the player phase dictated by a continually depleting meter, and an enemy phase that lasts for a few attacks. Enemy attacks are telegraphed with visual cues, and these cues tell you which guard type you should use, either physical guard or magical guard. Blocking depletes your defensive layers, and once your layers are gone, you're vulnerable. Parrying conserves your layers while negating all damage, but requires precise timing. You can increase your player phase time by breaking enemy guard icons, and once you do enough damage to fill the absorption meter, you can start the crappy absorption minigame to absorb the enemy for a skill point. If you accidentally kill the enemy instead of absorbing them, you can just restart the fight, so no worries there. And if the enemy kills you, no worries there either. You just get knocked out of the ring, shake off the disgraceful taste of defeat from your non-existent mouth, and jump right back in. Having no real punishment for death was such a smart move. Some of these fights can get fierce. You can lose in a matter of moments if you're not paying attention or timing your blocks right. So it was nice to be able to quickly jump back into combat while the enemy's moveset was still fresh in my mind. Nearly every enemy encounter had this gravitas about it that made each fight unique and fun. And these fights were almost always memorable. I'll never forget the lightning nightmare, no matter how hard I try. And I finally think I have combat out of the way. Is there more to it? You betcha. There are special moves and special blocks and a crap ton of other things I don't want to spoil here. Part of the fun with Worldless is that the game continually surprises you with how much you can actually do in it. And I don't want to rob that from you. Just know the combat's intense, fun, highly technical, expansive, and pretty fast paced for a turn-based system. This game will get your heart rate up with some of its more epic encounters. Although I was critical of the absorption minigame, there's just so much I loved about combat that it's easy to overlook the minigame's randomness.
Abilities.
Much like combat, I'm going to be a bit dodgy with abilities to avoid spoilers. Anywho, because the combat and platforming are completely separate from each other in Worldless, abilities are exclusively used for platforming and exploration. And the abilities aren't terribly unique. You have an air dash, a dash that lets you run on water and climb walls, a double jump, and a few other moves you've seen in other MVs. But what's here is great and works well with the level design. There is a unique twist that makes access to some of these abilities interesting, as well as adding extra challenge to platforming, but I'll save that for the spoilers. With that said, I'd like to praise Worldless for its bold compartmentalization of combat and platforming. Much like how I assumed turn-based combat would get stale in a Metroidvania, so too did I assume the same for combatless platforming. But in actuality, this separation worked exceedingly well. Like the yin and the yang, Worldless's high-octane combat was balanced by its much more chill platforming. And I found myself enjoying both parts of Worldless's complete experience equally yet differently. Platforming and exploration felt much more enjoyable and relaxing after having barely survived an intense battle. And battles felt much more intense after having enjoyed a twitchy yet non-punitive platforming section set to relaxing music. Worldless's diametric structure kept me hooked throughout its roughly 10-hour journey, with its emotional roller coaster peaking and dipping between mindfulness and intensity. This game is so meticulously well crafted, it's hard to believe.
Progression.
It's time I finally explained those constellations and nodes I mentioned in the intro. I played on the Switch, so to bring up the constellation, you have to click on the right joystick. The constellation will pop out of your head and acts as the map for your current biome. The constellation stars, or nodes, are quote-unquote rooms of that biome. I use quotes because the size and scope of each node isn't consistent, but it's not a big deal. Nodes start out empty until you discover the thing you need to absorb in that area. That thing could be an enemy from a combat encounter or a fallen ally or foe you can scavenge. Whatever the case, absorb the thing, and the node fills itself in to let you know you found what you needed in that area, absorption-wise. As an obsessive completionist who's never been accused of charity fraud, I find this node filling method integrated directly into the minimap to be an excellent way of tracking collectibles. But I can hear you now.
What's the deal with all the absorbing?
When you absorb something, it gives you a colored skill point, either blue or orange. You can allocate these skill points any way you want as long as you have the color of that node and the node is unlocked. That's really all there is to say about it. You see an open upgrade you want, you have the correct colored node, boom, it's yours. Y'all know how skill trees work at this point. Worldless's is no different. Pop in the skill point to get the skill and unlock the next node, then pop a skill point in the unlocked node to get that skill and unlock the next. Sometimes it even branches. Just keep absorbing stuff and filling in the skill tree, and you'll be OP in no time. Most enhancements either improve your existing moves, add passives like gaining more player phase time with each guard break you do, or give you more defensive layers. It's a tried and true skill tree system, and Worldless does that system justice. The minimap stemming from your head doesn't track everything. There are endurance shards and neutral shards littered all over the place, and they enhance your HP and player phase time, respectively. Endurance shards are simple. Find some dead guy and steal it off of them. Worst case scenario, now you're cursed. But at least your HP's increased, so worth it. I'm just kidding, that's not a thing in this game. Neutral shards are a whole different beast. Practically every neutral shard is obtained by doing some kind of puzzle. Sometimes you gotta sneak up on a shard like your Elmer Fudd during Wabbit season. Sometimes you gotta race to different points like Speedy Gonzalez. And sometimes all you gotta do is pulse on the shards like your Pepe Le Pew's throbbing heart. Y'all remember Looney Tunes, right? I have 20-something-year-old students who don't know the Looney Tunes, and it hurts my soul. Collecting neutral shards was always entertaining, whether it was figuring out a puzzle, doing a cool platforming section, or just being observant. Shards aren't tracked on your minimap, but uncollected shards are shown on the map screen once you fill a biome's nodes. So this should keep completionists happy, even if they're not allegedly stealing money from charity. And that's about the extent to which I'm willing to discuss progression without hitting spoiler territory. To summarize, the constellation that pops out of your head represents the biome you're in, and the nodes represent the rooms in that biome. When you absorb something in a room, its corresponding node fills in. Each absorption gives you a skill point to use in the skill tree to enhance your combat capabilities. Other enhancements include HP and player phase time increases found in shards during exploration. As long as you're willing to put in the effort into searching for shards and absorbing enemies in battle, you'll grow to be a strong... whatever you are.
Exploration.
I'll keep this section short and sweet. Mostly because I've touched on exploration throughout the other sections, but mostly because I don't want to spoil much. With its slow, ethereal music, exploration in Worldless is almost zen, especially if you explore the way I explored. Because exploration and combat are compartmentalized, I'd clear out as many fights in a biome as I could before I truly combed through the area. Enemies are finite, so once you absorb them, they never return, giving you free reign to check every nook and cranny without the fear of any jerks smacking you around. Some of these fights are vicious, so every encounter was an event. It was such a relief to absorb an enemy and get back to exploration because I knew, at least in the areas with filled-in nodes, I didn't have anything to worry about and could completely focus on the environment and shard searching. As mentioned previously, the main things you'll be searching for during exploration are enemies and fallen comrades and allies to absorb, as well as endurance and neutral shards that increase your stats. Finding these things typically requires acute observation and challenging platforming, and every discovery felt rewarding and earned. The biome layout's interesting. There's a hub area that's an empty void with a bunch of doorways to the different areas. Enter a door and you'll be where you want to be. Biomes are also interconnected, and the only way to get into the hub area is to find its doorway in a biome, meaning, except for important story instances, you never really have to visit the hub if you don't want to. You should, because there's an NPC there that provides some local flavor and gossip and isn't at all creepy. And it's technically the game's fast travel with all its doorways leading to all the biomes. This hub area method isn't my preferred method of fast travel, but because there's no benches or bonfires or prayer altars or anything to act as a save point that I could travel between, the hub doorways work well enough, mainly because the backtracking isn't that much of a hassle. Backtracking's only necessary for progression in a few parts of the game. Most backtracking's really just to find shards and things to absorb to make your character better, which you totally should be doing. Based on how difficult some of these fights get, I couldn't imagine winning without obsessively upgrading my character. But I never felt I needed to backtrack with every new traversal ability gained. There's so much to do and see in Worldless, I wasn't concerned with getting lost and instead just wandered from node to node to see what I could discover. And if I got ability gated, it was no big deal because I knew I could return to any unfilled nodes later. As for the game's structure, Worldless is a pretty non-linear experience. Most of the game's objectives are placed on the map for you, but even then, you're free to explore however you want as long as you don't get gated. Even in the early game, I went into a biome way above my pay grade early on and had a blast getting my ass handed to me. I actually like when MVs place objectives on the map, but allow players to engage them whenever they feel like. Much like what Hollow Knight did with the Dreamers and Ghost Song did with the ship parts. Sometimes I like to wander around aimlessly, but sometimes I like a little guidance. And Worldless does a great job of balancing when to direct players and when to back off. Alright, to sum it up, exploration in Worldless is a rewarding experience with a great approach at balancing when to direct players versus when to let player agency reign supreme. Compartmentalizing combat and exploration works surprisingly well and helps keep players focused and motivated. And that's it for exploration until we hit the spoiler section. Trust me when I say there's more to discover than what I've shared so far. I'd just rather you discover it yourself.
Atmosphere.
What can I say about Worldless's atmosphere other than it's beautifully captivating? I've mentioned the game's abstractness and ethereal soundtrack, but you can't really appreciate how well these two aspects mix until you play the game yourself. You can get just as lost in the game's ambiance as you can the game's caverns. Worldless exudes an otherworldly vibe. The character designs are pretty generic, but they work. They're mostly floating geometrical shapes that form some semblance of a thing you'll recognize, like a warrior with a sword, an angel, a unicorn, or a phoenix. It's the game's stellar animations that transcend these generic designs into something more interesting to behold. Watching your warriors' fluid strikes and graceful movements never got old, and the battle's pure spectacle was enthralling. Yet I never felt too distracted. For a game that requires perfectly timed parries to survive, that's quite a feat. The world you explore is just as enthralling. Each biome's distinct with a specific gimmick or mechanic to make it memorable. Plus, they're color-coded, and that helps out way more than you'd realize. But the one aspect that makes Worldless's atmosphere so fascinating is its mystery. What's actually going on here? Who's fighting and why? What even is this place? Who's this big guy? How old is he? And who are all these beings in the sky he keeps rambling on about? These questions won't be the only things living in your head rent-free. There's a few other oddities you'll stumble across in your exploits that'll also have you scratching your head. But I'm not spoiling any of that here, and the game can remain unspoiled for you if you go to this timestamp to hear my final thoughts. For everyone else, stay put so we can talk about the narrative and spoilers.
Spoilers.
Typically, I have an entire section just for the narrative, but there's really not much story here, as you can imagine from a game so abstract. I'm not certain I really understand everything that's going on, but here's my attempt. You're a cosmic being, and your nature dictates that you absorb your counterpart. Upon absorption, you both become a green thing. I don't really know what the green things are, but they're not good, I think. The big guy you speak with throughout the game alludes to the player character needing to overcome her nature for some reason, and what that means is she needs to not absorb her counterpart and instead work with them. To what end, I have no idea, but that's what she does. She meets up with her counterpart, decides not to absorb him, and they join forces for the rest of the game. This part was so awesome because now you can switch between characters on the fly, and the black counterpart has his own set of moves, not just in combat, but he also has his own traversal abilities. Being forced to switch characters made platforming sections much more complex, challenging, fun, and rewarding. And if you want to talk about challenging platforming, let's talk about the Path of Determination. This is unlocked by collecting a secret green petal from each biome, and it is a son of a bitch. It's the equivalent to Hollow Knight's Path of Pain in that the Path of Determination is an extreme test of your platforming chops. It's not as hard as the Path of Pain, but it does end with the hardest enemy in the game. This giant green dragon can go f*** himself. He was the only enemy in the game I didn't absorb. He's insanely difficult and requires a degree of mastery over the game's combat system that I just didn't want to achieve. So, if you want a real challenge, this stupid dragon will be waiting for you at the top of the Path of Determination. I was so pissed that my reward for finally overcoming the game's hardest platforming section was the game's hardest enemy. And defeating him nets you a spear attack that, quite frankly, you don't need because you just beat the hardest enemy in the game. Granted, there's a challenge mode where you can fight every enemy in the game gauntlet style, but I won't be doing that, thank you. I'm plenty satisfied with my victory over the Lightning Nightmare. That dude was a complete cunt. Anyway, let's finish up the narrative, or at least attempt to. Once you team up with your counterpart instead of absorbing him, you then have to find and absorb 3 enemies who'll give you green nodes for your skill tree. I have no idea why these nodes are so important, but they are, because every time you get one, the sky cracks to reveal one of those huge eyes from the Tool album, Lateralis. Once all 3 of those specific green nodes are collected, the eye from the Tool album, Lateralis, comes down from the sky. You go to the hub, enter the big guy's mind by pulsing at him, and you're transported to a battlefield full of giant spears. I suppose these spears are a reference to the Spears of Longinus from Neon Genesis Evangelion, but who knows. At the end of this battlefield awaits the eye from the Tool album, Lateralis, and it's speaking some kind of language at you. I didn't know what to do, so I literally didn't do anything, seriously. I channeled my inner Doctor Who, placed my controller down, and just watched. Eventually, my pacifism and curiosity was rewarded with a spear through the chest. Rude. So the other member of the party steps in, and to save their buddy, the 2 player characters merge and then... the Big Bang. Well, that happened. Roll credits. I have no idea how to interpret this. I guess the eye from Tool's album Lateralis was God, and the player characters were manifestations of abstractions that represent two things that merge together to make reality? Yeah, that sounds pretentious enough. Surely I'm correct somehow. Maybe this ending makes sense to someone much smarter than me. I'd love to hear your all's take on it. I was able to find the game's hidden lore, and I figured it out all by myself and felt like a genius. I'm not gonna say it's Fez or Tunic levels of secretry or mind blowetry, but I was genuinely surprised when I found it. And that means a lot to an old MV head like me, because I've uncovered a lot of secrets in my time. Of course, I'm talking about the stone pillars or monuments you find throughout the game with weird markings on them. If you stand on one, you can pulse and switch characters in a specific order to unlock a portal to a lore tablet. There are 5 in total, and they chronicle what happened to the big guy's race, I do believe. I'll flash the tablets up on the screen for your viewing pleasure. Discovering this was an absolute thrill, and the feeling you get while walking around the dark room and coming across that enormous tablet with the spear in the background is the kind of high I look for in a Metroidvania. What's most interesting about these tablets is that pulsing on them activates a giant beam. Activate all 5 tablets' beams, and the next time you enter one of the monument's portals, you'll be transported to a secret boss named Luca. It's a relatively easy battle that's more of a puzzle, and you don't get anything for defeating it other than an achievement. I've heard from somewhere that Luca stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor, so maybe that's significant to the story. Sorry I don't have all the answers. I'm just presenting all this to y'all. If you have answers, feel free to enlighten us in the comments. Regardless if the Luca fight has some hidden revelation that'll blow this narrative's cover, it's still very disappointing. I was so proud to solve these tablet puzzles all by myself and was looking forward to some amazing reward. Instead, I got a boring fight with no fanfare, and it didn't even lead to an alternate ending. That's right, we got ourselves another one-ender, boys. Oh well, perhaps the real reward was the friend I made along the way. Too bad I got him impaled. Whoops.
Conclusion.
If you've been paying attention, it's no secret I love Worldless, but it is surprising, at least to me. I went into the game thinking I was gonna hate it and actively pushed it further and further into my backlog because I didn't like the idea of having turn-based battles in a Metroidvania. But son of a bitch, if the devs didn't knock it out of the park. The combat was thrilling, platforming was fun, exploration was intriguing, and the atmosphere hit all the right notes for me, being mysterious and abstract while also creating beautiful environments. I will say I was a little disappointed in the narrative and some of the secrets payoffs, but that could just be that I'm not smart enough to understand all the sciencey stuff the game seems to be leaning on. Would I recommend Worldless? Yes. Very yes. I had a blast with the roughly 10 hours I spent with it, and I cannot impress upon you how heart-pounding some of these battles can get. Whether Worldless is right for you really comes down to how interested you are in the game's combat. This goes for MV vets and noobs. If you think the combat looks good, then get this game pronto. If the combat doesn't pique your interest, then you might want to skip it. But for everyone who does give Worldless a shot, you won't regret it. It's a fun ride from start to finish and is simply out of this world.